First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Alvin Roth. He's the Craig and Susan McCaw Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the George Gunn Professor Emeritus of Economics and Business Administration at Harvard. He shared the 2012 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. His research, teaching and consulting interests are in game theory, experimental economics and market design. The best known of the markets he has designed, or in this case redesigned, is the National Resident Matching Program, through which approximately 25,000 doctors a year find their first employment as residents at American hospitals. He's also helped in the reorganisation of the market for more senior physicians as they pursue subspecialty training and in other labour markets. He helped design the high school matching system used in New York City to match approximately 90,000 students to high schools each year, starting with the students who entered high school in September 2004. He also helped redesign the matching system used in Boston public schools, recently adopted for students of all ages starting school in September 2006. More recently, he's helped design school choice systems in several other large American cities, and he's one of the founders and designers of Kidney Exchange in the United States, which helps incompatible patient-donor pairs find life-saving compatible kidneys for transplantation. And today, Professor Roth is going to talk about the repugnant markets, prohibited transactions. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alvin Roth.
Thank you. So it's with some diffidence that I come to speak to a conference of experts on trade, since I'm not, I haven't made a professional study of international trade. But when I was looking at the World Trade Organization Bali Agreement, I noticed that one of the things that countries are supposed to publicize in order to facilitate trade are their prohibitions on trade, the import and export prohibitions. And so my topic today is about prohibited transactions, and more generally about repugnant markets, about things that we might have reservations about seeing traded. So forbidden transactions, as they show up at borders, might be unilateral. They might be embargoes or sanctions that one country has against another, but they're also embodied in international treaties. So, whoops, okay, I can see it's going to be a challenge today. Okay, so for instance, here's the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. So we may have special concerns about the cultural heritage of nations, and we might not like to see some things exported, and we might not like to see them imported, and these are the subject of international treaties and presumably the concern of customs. Similarly for pollutants, here's a page from the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer, which includes things about the international trade of ozone-depleting substances. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is involved in things like narcotics and also human trafficking and migrant smuggling. So these are also trades that show up at borders. Sorry. Here's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So just today, actually yesterday, when I was reading the newspaper, I learned that Hong Kong is about to destroy its stock of elephant ivory. So not only are there international treaties concerning this, but countries take their own actions. Here's a headline from the United States that the Obama administration is putting new restrictions on ivory trade. And here's a picture of the destruction. This picture is from the Philippines, actually. Destruction of elephant ivory. So the destruction of elephant ivory is a very graphic way of thinking about what we mean by transactions that we don't like to see, because the elephants whose ivory is represented in the picture are already dead. The ivory has been confiscated by the customs. You might imagine that because they are parties to this treaty and don't want to see elephants killed, that they could do other things than destroy the elephant ivory. They could sell it, for example, driving down the price of ivory and making it less profitable to kill protected species. But that's not what they're doing. They're destroying it. And I think that speaks to two things. One is the difficulty of stamping out the trade and wanting to make sure that any trade is illegal trade. But the other is the real distaste that we have for killing elephants for ivory. So they're doing this very visible gesture to show that this is a kind of trade that we don't approve of. Now, I became interested in forbidden transactions because of work that I do on kidney transplantation. If there's time at the end, I'll tell you a very little bit about that. But kidneys are the kind of thing that one person can transfer to another, because you each have 2 kidneys. And so if you're as healthy as I hope you are, you could give a kidney to someone who needed one because they had kidney failure, and that would save their life. But while you can give a kidney, you may not sell one in most countries of the world. The slide is showing a sentence from the United Nations National Organ Transplant Act of 1984, which says it's unlawful for any person to knowingly acquire, receive, or otherwise transfer any human organ for valuable consideration. So American law says that you can't buy and sell kidneys. And it's not just American law. The Council of Europe's Protocol on Human Rights says the human body and its parts shall not as such give rise to financial gain. So there's a widespread concern about human body parts that leads to laws in most countries in the world against buying and selling them. A notable exception, incidentally, is the Islamic Republic of Iran, where there is a legal market for kidneys, but that market also has restrictions. The Iranian law says that if I buy a kidney from you in Iran, you and I must share the same citizenship. So Iranians can buy from Iranians, Afghans can buy from Afghans. I think those are the only 2 active parts of that market. But again, it's a market with many restrictions. Now, making markets illegal doesn't make them disappear. So here's a headline from Australia that says Australians are lured overseas for illegal kidney transplants. So where are they lured? It turns out that there are black markets for kidneys, black markets meaning markets that are illegal even in the country where they take place. In many places, taking names from the news, you find a lot of countries mentioned. One of the news stories I have here is from it's not so recent, it's from December 2010 from The Guardian, and it speaks about Azerbaijan. It says, Azerbaijan's Prosecutor General's office said last month that an investigation prompted by information from Ukrainian police found citizens of various countries had been brought into the country for illegal kidney transplants. So again, this is an issue that might concern those involved in border control. Now, now kidney transplantation is legal everywhere. So what's illegal is the sale of kidneys. But even where it's legal, there seems to be specific resistance to international transactions. So here I'm showing you an article by Frank Delmonico, who's the current head of the World Transplantation Organization. And the title of the article, which appeared in the British journal The Lancet, is A Call for Government Accountability to Achieve National Self-Sufficiency in Organ Donation and Transplantation. And what that article is about, it's a movement among the transplant community to avoid international transactions, even legal ones that do not involve money. So the World Health Organization has a Madrid resolution that, among other national responsibilities, talks about self-sufficiency. That is, what they're saying is they disapprove of people crossing national borders in order to get organ transplants. Now, once again, of course, that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Here's, in the EU, here's a headline from England which talks about the perfectly legal movement of patients from one EU country to another to get organ transplants. And the headline says, "Why are so many foreign patients allowed to come here and take organs donated to the National Health Service?" So the subject of my talk today is going to be repugnant transactions. So I'm just trying to give you some sense of the kind of transactions that are in one place or another sometimes found to be distasteful. Again, it doesn't mean that there isn't international trade in organs. If you look at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, what you find is most of the organ transplants that Saudi citizens receive happen elsewhere. Most of that is perfectly legal. Saudi patients go to far places to receive medical care. Among the kinds of medical care they receive are organ transplants. So that's to set the stage for my topic today, which is repugnant transactions. So let's call a transaction repugnant if some people would like to engage in it and other people think they shouldn't. So, for example, by this definition, kidney sales are widely repugnant because most countries have laws against selling kidneys, but there's no doubt that people who need a kidney in order to live might be willing to buy one, and there are certainly people around the world who are willing to sell their kidneys because if you're healthy, you can remain healthy with just one kidney. So it's a repugnant transaction. It's far from the only one, and some repugnant transactions have been very important economically. So let's think a little about those. Let me take a step back and say it's a repugnant transaction selling kidneys, but it's not inconsequential that that's repugnant, because people with kidney failure die from lack of kidneys. In the United States, we presently have over 100,000 people waiting for kidney transplants from deceased donors, but we're only able to do, in the United States, around 11,000 transplants a year. So we have a big shortage of kidneys for transplant. Now, you can also get kidneys, as I mentioned, from living donors. So we've got this queue of 100,000 people. When economists look at a queue for a scarce resource, we're inclined to think that the reason there's a queue is the price hasn't been allowed to adjust. And indeed, the price of kidneys must be zero by law. A transplant has to be a gift. So these repugnant transactions can be consequential. So I don't know why we have laws against simply buying and selling kidneys. But as I started to mention, there are lots of repugnant transactions that have been important historically, and that's the kind of thing that I want to talk to you about today. So let's look at some historically important repugnant transactions, some of which are changing rapidly. A good place to look for repugnant transactions is sex, right? Remember, a repugnant transaction is one that some people would like to engage in and other people think they shouldn't. So there have always been situations where some people would like to have sex with each other and we think they shouldn't. And in my country, in the United States, we're now seeing a revolution underway in today's newspapers in how we think about same-sex marriage. So for a very long time, until the last 4 or 5 years, I think, the only marriages recognized in the United States were marriages between one man and one woman. But the state of Massachusetts was the first American state to recognize marriages between two men or between two women, one man and another man, or one woman and another woman. And today, we have about 20 American states that recognize same-sex marriage, but about another 20 that have passed constitutional amendments prohibiting same-sex marriage in their state constitution. So this is an issue over which Americans are very divided. And it's a prototypical repugnant transaction, because a marriage, in this case a same-sex marriage, is something that a transaction that two people would like to engage in, and that other people think that perhaps they shouldn't. Now, that's an ancient repugnance that in the United States and elsewhere in the world seems to be changing, getting less repugnant. But it's not the case that repugnance gets less over time necessarily. It's not the case that as we get modern, old repugnances fade away. In my country, we used to have a market for slaves. We don't do that anymore. That's now a repugnant transaction. In fact, you used to be able to sell yourself into slavery in the United States in a kind of contract called indentured servitude. It used to be the most common way to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean. If you were in England, say, and you wanted to come to Boston, and you couldn't afford the passage on a ship, the ship's captain might say to you, that's okay, sign these articles of indenture, and when we get to Boston Harbor, I will sell your labor servitude for 5 years to the highest bidder. I'll conduct an auction in Boston Harbor, and someone will buy your services. You won't be a slave, because after 5 years you'll be free of this obligation, but you'll be in involuntary servitude. If you ran away from your job as an indentured servant, you could be captured and brought back. So we don't do that anymore. That was once, again, the most common way to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean to America, but it's now a repugnant transaction. It violates the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that there will be no involuntary servitude in the United States. Interest on loans is another repugnant transaction. For many years, for many centuries in the Middle Ages, the Christian churches thought that making money from your money, charging interest on loans, was a bad thing. And today, in Islamic jurisprudence, there are still issues with interest on loans. But it's hard to imagine the modern capitalist economy that we have today if we didn't have a market for capital. So again, notice that the arrow of time points both ways. It's not that as we get modern, ancient repugnances fall by the wayside. Sometimes we discover things that we used to do that we wouldn't like to do anymore. So I mentioned that same-sex marriage is changing rapidly around the world. When I first started to prepare these slides before I left home, the headline I was going to show you was that the first gay marriage has just recently taken place in England and Wales. But from my hotel room, I can read the New York Times when I'm here in Baku. And each day that I've been here, there's been a new headline from the United States about same-sex marriage. So 2 days ago, a federal judge struck down the state of Oregon's ban on same-sex marriage. And yesterday, a judge struck down the state of Pennsylvania's ban on same-sex marriage. And today's New York Times reported that Pennsylvania's governor had said that he would accept this judicial decision. He wouldn't try to oppose it. So what those headlines suggest is that this ancient repugnance is in flux in the United States, but that Americans are very divided about it. The reason the governor of Pennsylvania is talking about whether he will accept a judge's decision or not is that lots of people in Pennsylvania will be unhappy to have same-sex marriages allowed in Pennsylvania, although many will be happy as well. Polls show that Americans now mostly favor allowing same-sex marriage. So that's a repugnant transaction that's becoming less repugnant in the eyes of Americans. So let's talk about lending money for interest, where something used to be repugnant that isn't anymore, and is very important in the modern economy. So Albert Hirschman, paraphrasing the great sociologist Max Weber, asks a question: how did commercial, how did commercial banking and similar money-making pursuits become honorable at some point in the modern age after having stood condemned or despised as greed, love of lucre, and avarice for centuries past? And it's interesting to look historically at the period in which public attitudes towards borrowing money and charging interest for money changed. In in the basement of the Harvard Business School, there's this mural that you see here, which, despite the way it looks, is not about same-sex marriage, but is about commercial credit. And it's from a speech that Daniel Webster made to the United States Senate in 1834. And his speech was about what a good thing commercial credit is. And he says, at the end there, it says, "It has done more, 1,000 times more, to enrich nations than all the mines of the world." So in 1834, in the United States, we still have American politicians explaining why we should not think of credit as repugnant, but rather as an important part of the functioning of a modern economy. As I mentioned, slavery and indentured servitude used to be not so repugnant in the United States as they are today. Let me turn to the question of bodies, since I started with kidneys. It turns out that medical schools have often had a demand for cadavers, for dead bodies, so that they can teach medical students anatomy. But in many places and for many years, it's been difficult to acquire or import dead bodies, cadavers. So here's an editorial from 1824 from the British journal The Lancet, and it's called Resurrection Men. And resurrection man was a euphemism for grave robber. It was by and large illegal in England at the time to get bodies for anatomy classes. The only bodies that British medical schools were legally allowed to use were the bodies of criminals who had been executed for murder. But there weren't enough criminals executed for murder to supply the medical schools of Britain in the 1800s. And so they dealt with grave robbers. They dealt with people who would rob the graves of newly buried people and supply the bodies to medical schools. And what this editorial is about in 1824 is it says, a reliable resurrection man has just been arrested and sentenced to be transported to Australia. And how will we do our business now without being able to get a supply of bodies? And not too long after, they had an editorial letter that said that it's probably always going to be illegal to get bodies in England. But it turns out that's not the case, because not many years later, the Anatomy Act of 1832 changed the legal status of bodies in England. And that's by and large happened around the world, so that today there is a legal commerce in cadavers. And you can see, for instance, sometimes for medical purposes, medical education, and for some kinds of surgeries, but you can also see museum exhibits that teach anatomy using the bodies of real dead people. So here's a Body Worlds exhibit that came through the United States in 2006, and it's artistically rendered cadavers to show you their anatomy, mostly originating in China. And you may find that more or less repugnant, but it's legal in the United States and in much of the world today to trade in cadavers, something that didn't used to be legal. So these things change over time, and they help us think about what kinds of trades we might approve of and what kinds we might not. So repugnance is a little bit of a funny subject, because many of the trades that we don't like to see, we have excellent reasons for not wanting to see, different than just that we don't like them. So, for example, we tend not these days to approve of mercenary soldiers. The repugnant transaction is hiring yourself out to be a soldier. We like national armies better than we like mercenary soldiers. And it's not just because we don't like people who kill for pay. It's also because when the Italian city-states defended themselves using mercenary soldiers, they found that this was actually quite an expensive and unreliable way to defend themselves. You had to marry off the captains of mercenaries to the daughters of princes, and it changed the way you governed yourself. But the fact that we don't allow mercenaries to the same protections as soldiers of national armies reflect some of the repugnance that we feel. So, for example, the Geneva Conventions say that a mercenary shall not have the right to be a combatant or a prisoner of war. Right? So mercenary soldiers are not protected by the rules of warfare, even to the extent that soldiers of national armies are. There's also transactions that we don't like because they have negative externalities. So, for instance, there are different laws about prostitution in different countries. Prostitution scores pretty high in surveys of transactions that Americans don't like. But it might be that people don't like prostitution, but it might be that they don't like the negative externalities. If there are prostitutes selling sex in your neighborhood, it changes the nature of your neighborhood. When your children walk to school, they might see things that you don't want them to see. So we could have practical objections to prostitutions as well as ethical and moral ones. And similarly with pornography and obscenity, and even more abstract things like blasphemy. Right, insulting people's religion. So here's a section of the Irish Constitution on blasphemy, and it's a part of the Constitution that starts off by saying the state guarantees liberty for the exercise of the following rights: the right of a citizen to express freely their convictions and opinions. But then it goes on to say that while preserving their rightful liberty of expression, it shall not be used to undermine public order or morality, and the public utterance of blasphemous, seditious, or indecent matter is an offense which can be punished by law. So, again, thinking about border control, one imagines that Irish customs officers who have to enforce this law have to worry about what kind of printed material, what kind of videos and things like that are allowed into the Republic of Ireland. So another kind of transaction that we might not like, but it might not be for simple ethical and moral reasons, would be addictive drugs. So in the United States, we had a constitutional amendment prohibiting the sale of alcohol. That didn't last very long. It was enacted in 1917, and it was another amendment canceled it in 1933. And in between, there were all these gangster movies about Chicago that are many people's primary impression of America. When we forbid the sale of alcohol in the United States, we didn't succeed in eliminating the sale of alcohol. We just made it a criminal activity. Today, of course, we continue to have bans on narcotic drugs. And once again, we don't succeed in stopping the sale of narcotic drugs. It's a thriving criminal activity. People might feel the same way about gambling. Some people suffer gambling as an addiction. And of course, prostitution, to the extent that it involves human trafficking or children who can't give consent, is not a matter of people voluntarily engaging in some transaction that other people think they shouldn't. It's involuntary. It's something akin to slavery, as is maybe addiction to narcotics. So the reason I'm mentioning all this is because I want to focus more clearly on repugnance. So I'm going to want to think about some simpler transactions that don't have this heavy weight of other concerns, like slavery to narcotics. Another issue before I do that is to say that sometimes we don't like transactions because we're afraid they make for bad incentives. So in the United States, we have laws about life insurance, which say that I couldn't be the beneficiary of your life insurance because I don't have an insurable interest in your life. Your employer, your spouse, these are people who could be beneficiaries of your life insurance. Now, as life insurance has become more like a financial commodity, it's also become more like property, and these laws have been relaxed. But the concern there was that no one should have a sinister interest in your life, that everyone should want you to live as long as you can. So let me turn away from these complicated cases and go to some uncomplicated cases. Nothing is really uncomplicated, but let me look at some simple, repugnant transactions that don't seem to have much going on, except that some people would like to engage in them and other people think that they shouldn't. So let me start with a question. Why can't you eat horse meat in California? I don't know if any of you have been to California and wanted to eat horse meat, but it turns out it's against the law, right? California Penal Code states in part that horse meat may not be offered for sale for human consumption. And in California, we have an unusual way of making laws. We have many usual ways as well. But one of the ways that laws can be made in California is by referendum. That is, if enough people, enough California voters are interested in seeing a law enacted, they can put it on the ballot by petition. If enough people sign the petition, the law itself goes on the ballot, and then everyone can vote yes or no. And this law was passed in 1998 by a ballot. So the law against eating horse meat in California is not some ancient Wild West law when cowboys and horses were important to the economy. This is a very modern law, and the reason it's against the law to eat horse meat in California is not that no one in California wants to eat horse meat. There's no law in California against eating insects. Cockroaches, you could do that if you wanted. The reason there's a law against eating horse meat in California is that some people would like to eat horse meat and other people don't want them to. So it's a repugnant transaction that doesn't have too much more going on than that some people think that horses are nice and you shouldn't eat them. When you go on the web and you search for horse meat, you find two kinds of sites. You find the American sites of people who think you shouldn't eat horse meat, and you find sites of places that sell horse meat, and they use the same kind of pictures. The pictures, both of the people who think you shouldn't eat horse meat and the people who are selling horse meat, show horses and say, aren't they beautiful? You know, delicious. Come and buy some horse meat. So this is a very complicated thing. In different times and places, you know, this is from an Italian supplier of horse meat. In different times and places, things that are repugnant in one place may not be repugnant in the other. And you know, my understanding is that horse meat is delicious, but living in California, I don't eat any, at least not there. Here's a transaction. The man with the helmet is a British dwarf. He earns his living in a kind of athletic endeavor called dwarf-tossing. He gets paid for allowing people to throw him for distance. This is about the longest dwarf-tossing on record. And he earns his living as a sort of professional athlete. He falls gracefully and isn't hurt. And it's legal for him to earn his living this way in England. But here's the Ontario Dwarf-Tossing Ban Act of 2003. So in Canada, this is a repugnant transaction. And the law isn't a law that says that that a dwarf who wants to engage in dwarf tossing must wear a helmet. There's already a helmet there. Oops, sorry. What the law says is it's very simple. It says, no person shall organize a dwarf tossing event or engage in dwarf tossing. That is, basically it says, yuck, don't do it. Now, a French dwarf, France also bans dwarf tossing, and a French dwarf who had earned his living this way took his case to the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights. And he basically, his case material said that France was denying him his right to earn a living. And France's case materials said that this was undignified and it should be against the law. And when you read the case materials, the dwarf has a very moving statement. He says, you know, there aren't many jobs for dwarves in France. And the essence of human dignity is having a job, and this is my job. And I remember thinking when I read that maybe he was going to win, but France won. I think states often win their fights against individuals in the UN. And the UN found for France saying that the ban on dwarf tossing was not abusive, but necessary in order to protect public order, including considerations of human dignity. So basically what the UN said is that when this dwarf who earned his living from dwarf tossing was earning his living in that way, he made each of us a little less human. That somehow this wasn't a good thing because it wasn't dignified for human beings to earn their living in this way. So again, this is a pretty complicated thought. But it's in a pretty simple case. It doesn't have big economic consequences, so we can see it for what it is. But it's very hard to it's hard for me, and maybe hard for you, to understand just what are the boundaries of what makes a transaction repugnant. So this is something that's illegal in France and Canada, but is legal in Britain. So it's not a universal human truth. It can be hard to predict, right? So something is repugnant about dwarf-tossing. So, some people would like to do it and other people don't think they should. But it's not just the small size of the dwarves. We look at horse races, which is small men race on large animals, and that's not repugnant, that's an athletic endeavor. There's a sport that isn't against the law anywhere that's called wife-carrying, which is, for me is very hard to distinguish from dwarf-tossing. These are not married couples, these are athletic competitors. The current world champions all use what's called the Estonian position for getting through the water hazards. It's very hard for me to think of a set of rules that would put dwarf tossing on one side and wife carrying on the other side and say one is repugnant and the other one isn't. So it's going to be hard to find a mathematical model that distinguishes what we call repugnant and what we don't, especially because these things differ in places and in time. So they're not universals. But often people feel pretty strongly about them. Now, one regularity that we do see is that sometimes something isn't repugnant until you add money. So interest on loans was repugnant in the Middle Ages because of the interest, not because of the loan. It was quite all right to make loans. It wasn't quite all right to charge interest on them. Adoption, we have international treaties on adoption, the Hague Convention, which say you cannot pay the birth mother for the child. So you can spend a lot of money on an adoption, especially an international adoption. It's expensive to adopt a child, but you can't pay the birth mother. Prostitution, which is legal in some places and not in others, mostly what we seem to object to is not the promiscuity, but the payment. In the United States, maybe elsewhere, we have some notion about amateur athletes. There are some kinds of athletes who aren't supposed to be paid, although other people can earn a great deal of money from them. We're seeing some debate about this right now, about the athletes who play football and basketball for American universities. So again, as I mentioned, reproduction is an issue. It's an issue that because there are different laws about who can pay for what, to whom you can pay, it gives rise to international trade and fertility tourism. For instance, technically, it's now possible to purchase the whole supply chain of producing a baby. You can buy sperm, you can buy eggs, you can buy a surrogate womb, you can have a woman bear the baby. And all of these things are legal to pay for in some places and illegal in others. And consequently, there's a demand on the part of people seeking fertility, sometimes to go overseas to purchase babies. And there have been complicated questions about citizenship and about repatriating such a baby. The question is, what does the birth certificate say, and who are the parents, and what is the citizenship of the baby when a baby has been created through gestational surrogacy, through purchase, perhaps, of sperm, eggs, and a womb. We all are able to recognize that for some transactions, money might not be appropriate. So here's a cartoon that appeared in the American magazine, The New Yorker, and it shows a man. Most people have no trouble recognizing who's the economist in this picture. It shows a man coming to a dinner party, and instead of bringing a house gift of a bottle of wine, perhaps, he says, "We didn't have time to pick up a bottle of wine." He's handing over cash, but this is what we would have spent. Okay? So you all understand that if you invite me to dinner at your house, I can do a lot of things to show my appreciation, but I can't offer to pay for the dinner. You are not a restaurant. if I tried to pay you for the dinner at your house, you'd think I was a terrible person. You'd say to yourself, what's the matter with this guy Al? Doesn't he understand we're not a restaurant? When we invite someone to dinner at our house, that's an act of friendship, and you can't pay for friendship with money. You have to offer friendship in return. So there are some kinds of transactions that, inviting people to dinner is a perfectly ordinary transaction. Offering to pay for it is repugnant. So this issue of money and repugnance, it's not just the existence of money. Sometimes high prices can be repugnant, and sometimes low prices can be repugnant, even where we allow money to enter into the transaction. So in many American states, we have laws against price gouging, and of course, international trade disputes often talk about low prices, talk about dumping, right? So there are things that are legal to cross your borders at some prices maybe, but not at others. Oops. Okay, so let me think just a bit about how money seems to play a role in repugnance, particularly when you think about things like kidneys. 3 words come up very often, 3 objections. One is called objectification. You're treating body parts in ways that they shouldn't when you buy and sell them. Another is called coercion or exploitation. It's concern about who will be selling their body parts and whether this is good for them or not. And the third is slippery slope. Will we be living in a less sympathetic society than we would like to if we started to allow the sale of body parts, for example? So objectification, I already showed you the sentence from the Council of Europe Protocol on Human Rights and Biomedicine. It says, the human body and its parts shall not as such give rise to financial gain. So it's the as such here that I want to draw your attention to. It says people are somehow different than the ordinary objects of commerce. Transplantation, of course, is very expensive. You can spend a lot of money getting your health back, but you can't buy the organ. That has to be a gift. So coercion is another complicated subject. There was a recent coercion story in the Israeli news that said the head of Israel's debt collection agency says that debtors are selling organs to make payments. So you could imagine that someone who borrows money, particularly who borrows money from criminals, might, if they were in a place where it was possible to sell a kidney, they might find themselves being compelled to sell a kidney. Okay, and of course there are black markets. Making markets illegal doesn't make them go away. So apparently crime in Israel sometimes takes this form of coercing someone to sell a kidney. Well, I could tell you other arguments relating to kidneys, but let me just mention again before going back to kidneys in a different way. Let me just mention that these aren't universal truths, right? I'm certainly not telling you what transactions should be repugnant and what not, and I don't pretend to understand which are and which are not in different times and places. But these things do change over time. And so when we're talking about transplant tourism, the current issues that divide us are questions about surrogacy. But not so long ago, I think in the 1970s, was the first time that doctors figured out how to help infertile couples create a child outside of the body with in vitro fertilization. That was for quite some time greeted with a great deal of repugnance, but in 2010 it won a Nobel Prize. That doesn't mean that there aren't still people who find it a repugnant transaction, but that's not the dominant view of fertilization now. In the United States, we are having constant debates about how the National Organ Transplant Act should be interpreted in terms of allowing compensation for donors. There's been active back and forth recently about whether bone marrow is the kind of organ, like a kidney, that should be that it should be illegal to compensate the donors. A couple of American states, all American states have laws against narcotic drugs, but a couple of American states have relaxed their laws against marijuana, either decriminalizing the use of marijuana, legalizing the production of marijuana for medical purposes, or lately in Colorado, simply making it a legal product. So marijuana is a drug that lots of Americans enjoy, like alcohol. They enjoyed it when it was a criminal act to do so, and in some states it will no longer be a criminal act. So repugnant transactions change over time. Now, I'm a market designer. Like you, I get involved in the operational details of markets. And so one of the questions that I end up having to deal with in my work is taking laws as at least temporarily fixed. What can we do to bring some of the advantages of trade to people who ordinary trade would be repugnant in the place where they live? So you can, of course, try changing laws, but you can also try finding other ways to get the benefits of trade. So I'm going to very briefly tell you about my work on kidney transplantation, which involves kidney exchange. So you might think it's odd that an economist gets involved in kidney transplantation because that sounds very medical, but exchange is very economic. So let me tell you how exchange comes into kidney transplantation in a way that has now become standard in the United States and is also done around the world in many places, including Australia. I started off by saying that there was a shortage of deceased organ donors. So a big source of kidneys is kidneys from people who have just died in a way that leaves their kidneys intact even though they are dead. So people in automobile accidents, for example. But it's also possible for a living person to give someone they love a kidney. And you have to be healthy to do so. So you might want to give someone a kidney and not be healthy enough. But you can also want to give someone a kidney and be healthy enough to do it, but find that they cannot take your kidney because a lot of matching has to go on before someone else's kidney can operate in your body. And this is what opens up the possibility of exchange. So here's a picture of a very simple kind of exchange. In the first row are donor 1 and recipient 1. They love each other. Recipient 1 needs a kidney. She's dying of kidney failure. And donor 1 would like to give her one of his kidneys. But they can't because he's blood type A and she's blood type B, and it turns out that doesn't work. And below, you see another pair with exactly the same problem in reverse, right? She would like to give him a kidney, but her blood type is blood type B and his is blood type A. And so a simple exchange is possible, right? The blood type B kidney can go to the blood type B patient, and the blood type A kidney can go to the blood type A patient. And this is something, it's an exchange. We see the economic benefits of trade here. 2 lives are saved, but no money changes hands. So you might ask yourself, I know there are some lawyers in the audience, you might ask yourself, is that legal under American law? Because the American law doesn't simply say you can't buy and sell a kidney. It says you can't transfer a human organ for valuable consideration. And that sure looks like valuable consideration. A kidney is being exchanged for another kidney. Well, you know, this is a deep philosophical problem, but we got an amendment to this law which says the preceding sentence does not apply with respect to human organ paired donation, which is a phrase for kidney exchange that avoids even the word exchange. This is the Charlie Norwood Living Organ Donation Act that was passed in 2007. So it turns out it was passed by acclaim. It was passed with no negative votes. It took 3 Congresses for us to get it to happen, but when it was finally passed, no American congressman or senator voted against it. So what that tells you is that this kind of exchange turns out not to be repugnant to Americans. Okay? Lives are saved, exchange goes on, but no money changes hands. And the same American legislative branch that passed the National Organ Transplant Act that says you can't buy and sell kidneys is happy to say that you can do this kind of exchange. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way, I think. Okay, so but it turns out that kidney exchange is logistically complicated to do, okay? Because you can't give valuable consideration. You have to conduct simple exchanges simultaneously, or at least we did for a while, because you can't write a contract on a kidney. So here's a picture. I'm the man in the yellow gown. And this picture is taking place in Cincinnati, Ohio. And at the same time in Toledo, Ohio, another nephrectomy, taking a kidney out, and transplant, putting a kidney in, is taking place. So when we started, even the simplest exchange, like the kind I showed you, involved 4 simultaneous surgeries. That means 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams. So it was just hard to do this kind of exchange. One of the great benefits of the last couple of years as we've worked on this is we can now do much more elaborate exchanges, long chains of exchange. So here's a picture that has 60 people in it, 30 nephrectomies, taking the kidneys out, and 30 transplants, putting them in. And so a lot of what my work has been to figure out how to get the benefits of a market when a monetary market, a cash market, would be repugnant and illegal. And kidney exchange is now, there's some kidney exchange in Western Europe, but in Germany, for example, it's against the law. So not everyone thinks of kidney exchange as a perfectly okay thing to do. So on the other hand, this is my second to last slide, what kidney exchange does is it achieves some of the benefits of the market without using money, and thus without running into the barrier raised by repugnance. And so my general topic for an audience like you is that it seems to me that people who are concerned with border control and customs, you're one of the places at which we can exercise our collective judgment about goods and services that we think should not be traded. So, while the topic of this conference is the facilitation of trade, the Bali statement did talk about making clear which kinds of trades are prohibited. I think that this is a general question for social scientists of all sorts to think about. I don't pretend to understand what kinds of trades, the full scope of what kinds of trades are prohibited, but perhaps organizations like yours can help shed some light on that subject, which is, I think, an important one for the world economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Roth. Some interesting observations there, and one of the things that I've certainly picked up on is that making markets illegal doesn't make them disappear, and that's one of the challenges of border management, to deal with illegal markets, and how do we ensure compliance? But also, what's repugnant today may not be so tomorrow, and which brings us back to the fact that border agencies are essentially responsible for compliance with the law as it stands, and as the law changes, so does our response have to change. So some of these gung-ho officers who are firmly against the importation of certain things need to realise that, hey, the government could change the law tomorrow, and it then becomes customs responsibility to ensure compliance with that new law. But it does give us some insights into the sorts of things that we need to be conscious of as we're assisting in policy setting in relation to restricted and prohibited goods. So it's been a very interesting discussion. Thanks, Professor. A couple of other things I say I've picked up on. There is a vague customs link to this issue of the baby supply chain, and you were saying if all these things happen, then what is the nationality of the baby? Well, let me tell you, in customs terms, we'd say what are the rules of origin? What would be the the origin under those circumstances. So the baby supply chain might be something that we can use as an example in future things. The other two things I did note is one, that grave robbers and other criminals are sent to Australia as punishment. I think these days that wouldn't be seen as a punishment, and I encourage you all to come and visit Australia. We have changed. We're not all criminals. Some of us are. Some of us may be in this room, but it's a good place to be. But the other one that I do like is to bring back some of these concepts of repugnancy. I do like the one that says that the interest on a loan is a bad thing, and if my bank would adopt that principle, I think I would be a very happy man. So thank you for that. Are there any questions of Professor Roth? We have, I know we've been running a little bit over time, but let's take the opportunity for any questions. We have one. Is that Chris, is it? Chris, perhaps come to the front table and use one of the microphones there.
Yes, my name is Christopher Dallimore, and I work at the University of Munster for the Department of Customs and Excise there. I'd just like to thank Professor Roth for an excellent presentation. It was fascinating on a number of levels. I have perhaps a few points concerning terminology used in the presentation. Repugnance to me is an absolute, so that a transaction which is repugnant I don't think it's possible to, at least from my point of view, to describe it as virtuous. I think perhaps, conceptually speaking, it would be better to describe it, perhaps from my point of view, as morally ambivalent. The other thing that I wanted to point out was that, or the question I wanted to ask you, is trade itself morally ambivalent in the sense that following 9/11, for example, or going back a little bit further, we have the example of the Black Death, where rats were carried on trade ships and spread plague throughout Europe. Wouldn't it be, or would it be too cheeky to describe trade as itself being repugnant, that it always involves some negative effects? And referring to your reference, or pointing out your reference to a dystopia, would it be that you can only achieve true facilitation and true liberty of trade by being morally ambivalent, by viewing trade not in moral terms or in virtuous terms, but you could achieve trade facilitation by being a little less virtuous and by being a little less morally aspirational? For example, a quick example, AEOs, for example, it involves a lot of expenditure on security. By getting away from security, for example, could you achieve greater trade facilitation? And yeah, that would be my point. Thank you.
Well, let me try to address those in order. First, you say that maybe moral ambivalence would be a better term than repugnance for some of these transactions I've talked about. Speaking as an American, I can tell you that America, the country, is morally ambivalent about things like same-sex marriage, but individual Americans are all very sure one way or the other. So I don't know that that and so I think I like the term repugnance. You know, some people find same-sex marriage to be a repugnant transaction, others don't. We're morally ambivalent, but many people are quite sure that it's not an ambivalent issue. You ask if trade is repugnant. I'm sure that back in the dawn of time, there may have been some repugnance to trade. You can imagine the first hunter who came home one night with one rabbit to his cave, and his spouse said to him, "Bad day out in the forest." And he said, "No, actually it was a good day. I caught 2 rabbits, but I met this other guy from across the mountain and he hadn't caught any, and he offered to give me this nice arrowhead for one of the rabbits." And his spouse says to him, you sold our food for an arrowhead? So, but today we think that division of labor is a pretty good way. Very few of us grow our own food. So I don't think that we think of trade as repugnant in and of itself. And in fact, there's a whole literature on sort of the bourgeois virtues about trade causes you to deal with people who aren't in your family and to deal with them in an honest way and things like that. So there are certainly difficulties to trade, but I don't think that they're moral difficulties. Now, I should qualify everything I say by mentioning the famous critique of economists, which is that economists are people who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So I could, I don't see myself as an authority on moral issues, but I certainly don't think that trade is immoral.
Thanks very much. One question here. We'll make this the last because we're getting very close to time.
Good morning, Dr. Roth. Thank you so much for sharing that information. You mentioned about the Philippines, and mine is not a question, but I'm sharing some information. There was a study that came out this year from the University of the Philippines, and they mentioned that there are about 3,000 Filipinos who sold their kidneys already for an average of $2,500 per organ. And the problem is the seller turned out to be the brokers later on. So probably one of the problems is doctors are colluding also with the so-called donors. And it's good that the Department of Health just came out with an administrative regulations now banning the donation of organs of Filipino wives to foreign husbands because, they go into the channel of having fake marriages just to make the donation legal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much, and once again, thank you to Professor Roth. We're here talking about trade facilitation. Of course, trade facilitation is about facilitating the legitimate and licit trade. We can't ignore the fact that there's other trading going on, and that's where the compliance requirements come in from a customer's perspective. So we need to consider that. But I think the other thing that Professor Roth's address has highlighted is the fact that when you look at the restrictions and prohibitions on imports and exports in different countries, they can vary quite differently. And if customs is in the game of helping to set the policy, and I think that's an important thing because it's one thing for policymakers to come up with these particular prohibitions and restrictions, but then customs needs to also say, well, is it practical? Is it going to be feasible and practical to actually apply these particular prohibitions and restrictions? And so the background we've been given today, though, really gives us some insight into how these rules emerge. And so once again, I'd like you to join with me in thanking Professor Roth.